just figuring out what's going on with all these women, especially the white women. They tend to be that way to an extreme. The numbers just weren't working 10 years ago. One thing they did do, they made a big adjustment. They found out that males will sleep with anything, so they started targeting the white male Asian woman thing, and that's a lot more dangerous to us than any white woman black man, because that is there's not an African country most white women are going to live in. Yeah, sorry to say, there's not an East Asian country most white men couldn't live in. Think about that. If you go to somewhere like San Francisco, it's a full-on Eurasian merger going on there, and there's a shortage of European males globally. So don't ever be worried about the black men and white women, because that's just a byproduct of $100 trillion debt being run up trying to make equality work. If right now in Anglo-America, Anglosphere is coming apart at the seams, those relationships aren't going to work, and they won't continue to work because, well, reality is going to sink in. Reality is going to sink in very quickly. On the other hand, Eurasian is something that would concern me. I look at the direct opposite of most white nationalists. Whatever they're pushing on TV isn't going to work. The only thing that's worked for them, thank goodness they didn't learn that probably in the 70s, is the white male Asian woman thing. That works statistically very well for them. So that's something a little off topic. When it comes to political correctness, one of the reasons they dropped, they just can't. The numbers don't work. They came out with this study, it always makes Ameren, this is just recently, 5 million interracial children or something like that. Well, those numbers are nothing. By the way, if you're in LA or New York, it's a lot higher than that. There's probably some cities in the South that may be a little higher than that, percentage-wise, but their numbers just don't work. What's happened is, the only thing it's done is collapsed Anglosphere. It's totally collapsed Anglosphere. Yeah, it's collapsed Anglosphere totally. And that's one of the reasons, if you try to take China, 91% Chinese, to make it non-Chinese, you're going to collapse the place. You try to make the place non-European, at 89% European, you're going to collapse the place. Well, once again, that comes back to World War II. The neocons cannot, they're trying like crazy to get rid of affirmative action and stuff because it's destroying the country. You got all these incompetent people running around. They got to run a country with a bunch of incompetent people that shouldn't be in these positions because of affirmative action. It makes it impossible. Everything that went for them is now going against them in a big way, and it's kind of hilarious and tragic at the same time. In my opinion, the worst case scenario for our race, the indigenous white rabbits of Europe, would be a collapse of a Anglosphere that never makes it back, and the best brightest just go on, or everyone migrates into like a German-Russian axis back into Europe. Once they're out of the way, once Anglosphere is out of the way, Pooty-Poot will run across and be the savior of Europe, and he'll do it in an afternoon because they don't have any power there. No one has really any weapons to challenge us. That's the worst case scenario. One of the interesting things about our race is no matter how demoralized, no matter how brainwashed they are, they're still, the indigenous white rabbits. They're still little white rabbits. I remember when New Orleans happened. Many of you guys remember that disaster in New Orleans. There was some groups of kids here from like Australia and in the UK, and of course those are very, very demoralized, very anti-racist to the core populations. Every propaganda technique known to man has been unleashed on them very effectively because they're not as interracial in many areas, or at least, well, I guess they are getting to be now. But anyways, they're caught in that Superdome, and they banded together and they survived, and none of them got attacked. But they probably got lucky. But most most whites in America, even on some conscious level, would avoid that place like a plague. What is funny in that whole New Orleans melee, if the federal government would have just stuck it out, most of the Africans probably would have been dropping off like flies after 3 days. Why? Because the water's all contaminated. I mean, if you don't do some planning for a disaster, if you don't have some water filters, that's the big thing. People worry about food, you better worry about water and water filtration. It seems like the whites were doing pretty well without the government getting involved. The Africans, if the government wouldn't have showed up, they would have been toast, wouldn't they have? Sure, most of them wouldn't have made it because, believe me, if you don't have fresh water, you're in trouble. You're in trouble very quickly on this planet. People are always worried about food. Well, you can get food. You can get food at a variety of different places. Fresh water is a big problem in that type of situation. But Africans are another group, demoralized, very demoralized. You wouldn't see Zulus can get out of the way of a hurricane still. They're not demoralized, but Africans in America, they'll scream. There's a great percentage that are too far gone. True information won't mean anything, will it? Yeah, they'll scream racism until they're all dead. Just like the self-hating, their self-hating white neighbors, they'll scream racism. I mean, it's the same thing in a little bit different angle, but they have been totally demoralized. They can't see anything. I mean, I told one bright young black guy I know. He asked where he would go, where in the world's doing well, and I said there are a couple African countries that are doing well under a unique model. They're kind of sandwiched between the Anglo-American elites, Anglo elites, and Chinese, and they're kind of picking the best of both worlds, and basically been allowed to develop under an independent model. And that independent model that some of the African countries are developing under, like Sudan and Botswana, is very unique. It isn't a traditional type of model that we would see or we would even want to be under, but they're doing well for themselves. I mean, in an African way. Botswana's not doing that bad. A lot of these places aren't as bad as people think. They won't show them on Fox News so much, but some of them are doing quite well. We're used to seeing the places where, you know, all the kids have flies on them and stuff like that, but there are some places doing quite well if you're streetwise. It's not a place I would want to be, but if you're streetwise, if you're African, you could do quite well. Probably better off there than they are in Anglosphere, and some of them may get that clue. If I were African, I would do a tour of some hot spots, especially where you see a lot of human rights violations, because you know Anglo banking's not there. Yeah, if Anglo banking's not there, you're probably going to be doing quite well. And I'll go into some differences in banking because it's a big deal. Differences in banking is a big deal. People always want to talk about economics, and it all comes down to differences between private central banks and a state central bank. One issuing what I call currency, and one issuing money, which is really just debt. Yeah, private central bank can't really issue currency. They only issue debt, which is a problem because they can't pay down interest. But that's another story. I'll go into that in the next one. I'll do a brief overview of what's going on now in the banking, where this big fight's coming from, where this fight has always came from. It's a critical thing for you to understand how our enemy operates, because that's what they try to do, control that energy flow in regards to money. And it's more than just Hebrews too. Don't think it's just Jews. No, sorry. They're connected. Some of their guys at the top are connected. Many of them are, especially in Anglosphere, especially in America. They're going to be at the front of everything, but or at least have the appearance of being. But when it comes to Africa, there's a couple places doing quite well. Yeah, they're not demoralized. You see, they've had an internet up for long enough to start questioning all this propaganda from the anti-colonialism. You know, all of it is just ways to control a population through conflict, and they're not interested in that. You know, Sudan and Angola, they're running those ethnic conflict models, proper ethnic conflict model. You know, they got the Jaja weed out there dealing steel like cornmeal. You know, just wiping out rabbits, wiping out black rabbits right, left, and center. But they got China in there developing their infrastructure. For what reason? Who knows? China may take the whole thing, but in the short term, they're doing quite well for themselves. If you're a street smart African, you can do I'd say there's some parts in Africa that if you're streetwise, you can do very well. Some parts of Sudan they're building up. In Angola, they have some nice condos going in and whatnot. You got the Chinese building them. Well, I don't know how this is going to work long term, but it is what it is, and Botswana's done a lot better than people thought. But they're under a totally unique model. It isn't a particular Asian model. It isn't a particular Anglo model. It's African. If people are allowed to develop under their own unique, taking advantage of their own unique skill set, they can do quite well for themselves, at least under their terms. You know, what most people want, what most Africans want, or what most Africans want is not going to be what most Europeans want, or what the most Asians want. You know, they want things their own way. Everyone right now wants the third position. They want that self-determination, whether it be socialism or some quasi-sharing, some quasi-system based on free enterprise, whatever. They all want self-determination. And that's where our enemy has got itself in so much trouble lately. You got a rising coalition. Sometimes I'm accused of being a little too cryptic, but between who's facing off here in this end game. Well, one side is Anglo-American, a certain group of Anglo-American that their whole front looks to be Hebrew. the banking establishments in London, Wall Street, and Washington, everything attached to what you think of as the Warburgs and the Rothschilds, in my opinion, are facing off against the third position. The third position is led by Chavez. Chavez, of course, is accused of being a Nazi or National Socialist. He says he's a communist, but he's not.